In this episode, I'm with my co-host Nirmal Mehta of AWS and Ken Collins, an AWS serverless hero. Ken joins us again to discuss all the AI tools that developers and knowledge workers might use as our second brain. We're a little bit all over the place on this one, from talking about AI features in our favorite note-taking apps like Notion, to my journey of making an OpenAI assistant with all of my Q&A from my courses, thousands of questions and answers, to coding agents and more. Ken is a local friend here in Virginia Beach and was on the show last year talking about AWS Lambdas. And we've both been trying to find value in all of these AI tools for our day-to-day work. So I hope you find this trial and error that we've had with AI useful. So please enjoy this episode with Ken and Nirmal.
So Ken, who are you? You want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I've been on the show before. I'm an AWS serverless hero. I've been working with AI for about a good steady 2 years now. Have a lot of experience building commercial applications for it and software delivery. I use it every day for my own stuff. I blog at unremarkable.ai, where I try to advocate for anybody that's a practitioner. So I am not a machine learning person. I am not a data scientist. I'm someone that loves AI and integrating it in amazing ways. I work for a company called Torc.dev, and we do AI-powered talent delivery and engagement platform that help folks find jobs, not just with AI, any type of job. So if you're kind of interested in learning more about, or if you're looking for a job, go to Torc.dev.
I think you mentioned that Torc, it's like somewhat AI. Is there AI related to it in some kind of way?
If I have my way, it's going to be all over the place. I think primarily we use it in the searching and matching capabilities to help recruiters who may not actually have a lot of knowledge into exactly what makes a good fit for somebody at a particular job, like your best recruiters do. They know exactly if you're searching for somebody with Kafka, they know how to suss out those skills. They know how to take the job requirement and bring people. They know how to really kind of go through and do that work. So there's a lot of decisioning that happens in that AI can do. I'm not going to say AI is going to be matchmaking people, but you can automate a lot of work that normally is kind of, things that people aren't interested in doing. You can imagine if you're going shopping, it takes a lot of time to do research and visit a whole bunch of sites and understand the different things that you might be shopping for. And recruiters are kind of doing the same thing. And anything that can help them find you better is going to help hopefully us all out.
Yeah.
And that is what we're going to be talking about today, right? It's about how we're continuing to integrate AI tools into our own individual workflows. So we had a few shows about machine learning and AI over the year, and we asked folks if they wanted to learn more. And I believe we had one about RAG and on the Olama episode, and we had tons of questions from Maria when she came on and talked about all the different layers of MLOps and Gen AI, and there was a lot of interest. So we're back again, kind of more on the usage of AI in our personal workflow and like our day-to-day. So Ken, you want to just start us off with what are your ideas around how you've been leveraging AI tools for your workflows and for your day-to-day?
So for me, one thing that I'm really big on is trying to take a lot of things that I don't like to do, such as any type of writing, right? Like I feel I'm really good at it if I sit down, but there's a lot of context and research that goes into it. And I'm constantly pulling from weird places in my brain where I remember things or I'm sort of inspired by stuff. And the thing that I really want to do is I don't want to write blog articles or creative content or even technical direction or anything like that purely by AI, but I need it to help me start at it. And I'm learning to be more like trying to find a persistent co-pilot. Like I want something that I can talk to all the time. I'm finding that I'm actually a verbal person. I do like to sit down and stare at my screen and do things. And I do that by myself, but I'm finding the more and more I do it with AI where I can speak to it, I can just ramble on like I'm doing now and describe the problem and get feedback and have it do things for me. That is really amazing. And it's actually helps me think too. And I don't know, that's not something I've experienced before in software delivery or any type of technical knowledge work that I've ever done before.
I was going to ask real quick if we could all, like at some point we should mention like the tools we use, the LLM we prefer, or which LLM we prefer for which task. And I know we both, two of us at least, use Notion. So Notion is my, what'd you call it? Not digital brain, but...
Exocortex.
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 I'm gonna have to adopt that. I literally have a part of my Notion called digital brain, and it's just whenever I have a thought about everything that I know I'm going to forget, I just write it randomly in there, and I just rely on the AI search now, because if you pay extra to Notion, not a fan of all this paying extra for AI features, but I understand it's expensive, and you can pay in Notion to it basically rags all your data, so you can just ask questions about everything you have in Notion. So I can just ask it, hey, how many, what's the model of my TV? Instead of having to like search the LG TV on my wall so I can find the model number, I can just ask it, what model is my LG TV? And that results in faster information than me searching for the page, finding the page, scrolling down the page to where I'm looking for the information. It hasn't hallucinated on me yet for that particular part. So I don't know if you tried that at all, the AI conversation stuff in Notion.
I have. I don't know if they've rebranded it. It definitely came out about maybe 5 or 6 months ago in beta for folks to try. And I think within the last 2 weeks, maybe 3, they personified it, gave it a new sort of sketchy type of icon, and it sucked a lot less. It could actually go through and do things that it couldn't do before. You could ask it. I find it doesn't do structured retrieval well, so I can't contextualize, hey, last week within all of my meetings, find some tidbit about where we're talking about. It doesn't, it's got general RAG retrieval, it seems, and it can pull back like what I call the sort of salt and pepper knowledge back, but it's not really deep thinking, and it doesn't know how to partition quite right, but it does suck a lot less, and I have used it.
My biggest gripe about it is that little icon you're watching on the screen there, it doesn't stop moving. And so I have a dual monitor setup. So it sits there on the side of the screen, and it's not that big of a button. It's like this big, but it's constantly moving. And so my eye catches it thinking that I've got a status or a notification of some sort. And it's just him. It's just the little guy or her or it just like winking or moving its face. I don't know why it does that. It's cute, but I need to tell it to stop moving. Like, you're distracting me. It's like Clippy. It's like Clippy sitting there moving around and like itching.
Is Clippy useful now? So as someone who hasn't done this yet, how do I start? How do you all do this? So both of you are using these tools. We can get into what kind of tooling and workflows you use, but teach me your ways. How do I get started with all this? And how do I get the best usage out of these tools? Either one.
I think for me, because the Notion AI didn't work for so long, I started building my own solution. And I think it's actually probably going to be better than Notion's. And right now I had to write all the APIs that pull everything down with Markdown, right? So first you kind of get the knowledge out of Notion. Then I did some proof of concepts around, so I think Claude projects and ChatGPT are just going to be some really good. So you can drop 5 documents inside of ChatGPT at a time. I think it might be 7 in ChatGPT. If you haven't used it, use Claude projects. So one of the things I do often is now that I wrote the Markdown exporters for Notion, I have like a folder of hundreds and hundreds of just files. And I wrote a small ChatGPT assistant that can take and process through an API request. It will dump all 200, 300, 500, 1,000, whatever Notion pages I have and put them into a retrieval system. Then I ask ChatGPT to find everything around a particular context, and it pulls back document IDs up to 20 or 30. And then I'll take those 20 or 30 documents and then put them in a long context window, Google Gemini or Claude projects, and then talk to that specifically about it. So if I'm working on a particular programming project or a product project, I'll pull all that knowledge out. And a lot of my day-to-day stuff, it's weird. It's just, I call it like context wrangling, where I'm just sort of, I don't know, it's because I'm ultimately lazy and I'm just writing that proverbial bash script over and over again that will automate my job, but I'm only doing it once. But I would say, get into the context, no pun, of taking long documents and throwing them in a massive context window and then working a particular problem around those. And I think Claude projects and maybe Gemini are really good for that.
Do you categorize those pools of documents into specific types of, like if you're doing something that's more coding or architecture focused, like you have documents that are more related to that versus brainstorming, strategy, content generation? Since you have some awareness of maybe the categorization of those documents, do you pre-categorize those and then only pull in what you like loosely at a macro level know is like the knowledge pool for that specific work that you're doing, that specific task that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So Notion has a great ability where you can just label documents and just attach all these ad hoc tags. You can rely on those tags being semantically sort of anchored to the topic that you need. But in an advanced retrieval system, you would actually set up K&N pre-filters so that you could go find all the product or all the documents around a particular project that you're working on or something like that.
Awesome. So I guess then the next question is, if you're in Notion and making notes, then having that metadata, tagging that content in some kind of way is probably a good pre-step or something that you should be continuously doing, so that later on, knowing that you're going to be doing this RAG, like that becomes more important, right? Like just giving hints to the system.
I hope so. I think your retrieval is hard. And I don't know if we've covered that on other shows here with y'all, but it's actually, everybody thinks about documents and that's kind of easy to reason about, right? I can get word hits and pull back knowledge. Things are structured in our brains, right? We have knowledge in different places and we care about different things at different times. So anything that you can do if you are sort of keeping notes in whatever your exocortex is, whether it's Obsidian or Notion, something like that, always add some sort of categorization. And I think, Bret, you probably mentioned too, right? Like you have a particular folder structure within Notion that probably helps you do that, right? Like here are things that...
Yeah, databases and organizing things in different areas. I was getting ready to say that it feels like the trend is, like if you would have asked me a year ago what this exocortex thing was going to look like, the personal AI, I would have thought that it was going to be like what Google search for Windows was in 2005. Do you remember this? Like it was a tool you put on your Windows XP computer and it would just index your hard drive and then give you
like Sherlock back in the day.
It was meant to, like, back when we actually stored all of our stuff on our machine and not in the cloud, it was supposed to help you find everything. Email, it synced out, or it integrated to Outlook, so it indexed Outlook, it indexed all your files. If you pointed it as a sysadmin, my favorite thing was when people were pointing it at the file server and indexing the file server from their computers. That was fantastic on a 100 meg network link. And I would have thought that, like, we were going to see tools that would say, kind of bring that all back and say, I'm going to connect to your Evernote and your Notion and your Gmail and your Google Docs and your OneDrive, and I'm going to index all of that and then be your personal knowledge assistant. And I don't know if that actually exists yet. I saw it for a minute with Neeva, I think it was a paid search company, and they allowed you to integrate and connect to a bunch of different cloud data. And basically it was, of course, that's a security nightmare because now it's a giant system that has all of your information in one place with a startup company. That always goes well. And so what I feel like is happening is we're getting contextual AIs in for profit purposes, each one of these apps we're all using seems to want us to pay extra for AI in that app. And I feel like the AI subscriptions are becoming worse than my streaming subscriptions right now. I'm just waiting for them all to bump their prices, like streaming. And
it's a $20 paper cut.
It's like, it's no big deal when it's one, but now it's like, okay, I got Anthropic, I've got Notion, I've got OpenAI, I've
Perplexity, Cursor, right? I'm paying money to Cursor.
Yeah, Cursor. We're going to talk about Cursor because this is a dev show. We're going to talk about dev tooling. There's so many tools right now. It's actually easier for me to list the number of things I use that don't have an AI feature in them. I'm back to using NeoVim, and it has Google Copilot built into my NeoVim in my terminal. My terminal itself is connected to OpenAI, so it helps gives me a prompt it's not Warp, it's actually iTerm. And so, I mean, like everything, I've got so many AIs on my computer. I feel like it's actually one of my challenges is when I want to ask an AI a question, I have to think, okay, which one should I be using for which purpose? Mm-hmm. What app am I in? Or do I use a general one?
Which one haven't my tokens run out on today?
Right. Which one has the latest model? Or whatever.
So that's another question to both of you then is, does it make sense to have just one, like kind of standardize on one, or does it make sense to pick the right LLM model for that task and then have to do RAG separately for each one? That seems pretty complex.
O1 Preview is my favorite now. I'll use that for meeting summaries. So what I'll do is I'll take I'll maybe use Mac Whisperer, have it listen to all the meetings, do a transcription, which is interesting because it's doing the transcription locally on the Mac, right? So it's running that model locally. O1 Preview now doesn't have the ability to upload files, but it does have that full context window. So you can paste tons of information in there. I'll put the transcript in transcript tags. I'll set up a system prompt that says, okay, here is a conversation between me and somebody else. I'll give them the name. It'll automatically figure out, and then it'll go through, I'll give it a task of saying, write a summary with these specific action items in mind. And it will go through and it will think and reason about exactly that task. And it will reflect. I don't know if you've seen what O1 Preview can do, and it's reasoning steps, which I'm going to be very mad because OpenAI says they're going to take that away. They're going to take away the reasoning, and you'll just get the output. But actually, I think the reasoning is very valuable, and it should be. If I'm paying for it, I want it. Right.
Right. I was assuming that was because it was slow. Like maybe they didn't like that. Like it's expensive maybe for them to do all that.
No, it's not in the API spec right now to return it to you.
All right, I'm going to do rapid fire, and maybe we can pick what we think is like a topic we can dive deep into, because we've got a list. Someone mentioned Notebook LM, which I had not even heard of. This is the state of the system right now. It's like there's so much going on. I listen to AI podcasts every day, and there's this tool from Google that I know nothing about.
I thought it was old. Like it's been around for a while, so I don't know.
Okay.
Right, if I'm wrong on that. I thought Notebook LM was around for a while, and then all of a sudden it's hot lately.
It's over a year old. It was 2023. A research and note-taking online tool developed by Google Labs that uses artificial intelligence, specifically Google Gemini, to assist users in interacting with their documents. It can generate summaries, explanations, and answers based on content uploaded by users. That sounds like the Notion AI, or whatever your AI is in your whatever document system that you have. Yeah.
Interesting.
It's been making podcasts, Brett. Watch out.
I know. At the end of the show, Brett's going to try to replace me yet again with an LLM.
Eventually, I will be replaced. It's inevitable. Eventually, this will just be it'll be a show with our fake voices and cartoon characters acting as us, and we won't have to be here. It'll just be our digital brains.
Yeah. Our virtual avatar stunt doubles.
Yeah, AIs talking to AIs, watched by AIs on YouTube, summarized by AIs for AIs to watch and listen to, and then people will get a one-sentence statement about what this show was about today, and they'll go, "Oh, cool."
Interesting. I think in the future we'll probably have to cryptographically validate that we're real in the beginning of our show.
The "Are you a robot" is going to get so advanced that we're all sweating bullets. Yes. I may not pass the test.
All right. Okay, so
rapid fire. Oh,
yes.
Sorry.
What are the topics? What are the topics,
Okay.
Brett?
So we talked about this personal AI thing. Ken's doing stuff. I'm using OpenAI's assistants, and I have dumped 10,000 questions and answers from my courses over the last 8 years into it as basically like a RAG, and I can ask it and interact with it, and I can ask it questions about Docker and Kubernetes and get it back in my voice and my knowledge, and it actually marks if the answer was answered by my knowledge or just general knowledge. So There's that topic. There is, I could talk about Notion AI all day. Let's see. There's a great podcast on AI basics. Most of us are probably playing with this, but maybe for Nirmal, I'm just kidding. There's a great show that just came out this week. Actually, it was one day ago from one of my favorite podcasts, the Pivot Tech News podcast. And they had a New York Times reporter on that covers all the AI. She's an AI reporter. And so she was talking about, and she's also young, so she's essentially a different generation than me. So she had an interesting perspective because she grew up with, she had Facebook since she was a kid. So that's an interesting and short podcast. I'll put the links in the chat here in a second. We've got this Anthropic stuff happening. Like we talked about, you mentioned there's an app for my desktop now, I guess, that can control my machine. There's a personal AI thesis document I'm going to share with people on just what it means to be human and there's this other, this honestly could have been a show. We could have had a show talking about this show, which I just found yesterday, listened to this morning. Fantastic ThoughtWorks. ThoughtWorks is great. And they had this episode where they got all their meeting of the minds together and they broke down a lot of their AI problems and for developers specifically and what they're seeing as mostly negatives coming out of basically a bunch of anti-patterns for their devs, for their teams coming out of using AI, where they talk about they're having problem with PRs, they're having problem with code quality. It's not a pairing assistant, even though every company's your personal AI, pairing assistant or whatever. They use all the terminology like it's replacing a human, but this team of experts that are spending time on this every day and working with probably hundreds or thousands of developers around the world are like, nope, it is actually bad. It is not a good thing. It's not working. And so they've had to create anti-patterns and like sort of rules. It's not the problem of we don't like AI because of copyright or data theft or anything like that. It's more like AI for developers is actually causing more work for other humans and reducing code quality while also not actually delivering real value and not saving time. And so that's an episode I'll send out. We have Cursor to talk about this. I think we've all probably used it, or I know Ken and I have tried it. I was diehard on it for about 2 weeks, and then VS Code updated and to compete with it, and now I'm back to VS Code. So we can talk about that. Also, this thing you got to pay for, so yet another subscription for an AI that, I've got Copilot already. So, okay, take your pick.
Ken,
Guest choice.
What do you want to
Guest
talk about?
choice. What do you want to talk about, Ken?
Well, that is a long list. But maybe we start with a little bit of personal AI and talk about Claude a little bit, or long context windows. Right. So, or what is context? What are the interaction patterns around knowledge within AI?
So what are they? So I'm sitting here, Ken, and I'm asking you, you're paving this path and you're using these tools. How do I get started? What do I do with Claude and these projects? Step me through. We talked about pulling down my documents and the things, my, I guess, personal content source as step number one, that's hopefully tagged in some kind of way. What's the next step? Do I just dump them into a context window and I'm off to, it all works? Or what's the next thing I got to do?
Yeah, I think that's where you're going to get a little bit of value. But if we step back a little bit and go, what is knowledge in AI? Let's kind of go over the basics. So everybody, we first saw ChatGPT came out and you talked to it and it was able to answer you back. That's, I believe, is called the parametric data, right? That's sort of what I call if you had like a box and you had knowledge represented as a color, let's just call it blue. You might have like a light blue. That's the fuzzy knowledge. It's generally programmed in. It's the parameters that are sort of like the billions and billions of things that are the neurons that are connected there. So it has that knowledge, right? Now, when we do retrieval because it doesn't have new knowledge. Like, what's the weather in Virginia today? It doesn't know that. So that's, you give it the ability to make a decision when you ask for that it needs a tool. Something happens out of band, you go get that information, you bring that knowledge back. We call that in context learning, like an open book test, right? So it's the difference between you reading a book the night before a test and then trying to remember what was in it and then taking the test versus you going to class and having an open book test, right? You want the open book test. You want AI can know which page to go to and find the answer and answer that really quickly. The third is kind of like the retrieval aspect. And that is where you generally have tons of knowledge, like what Bret was showing us with the classrooms and the course rooms, where he took a ChatGPT assistance API, hooked it up to a vector database, presumably put several hundred, you're very prolific, Bret, all of your stuff in there.
10,000. It was actually 10,000 JSON documents.
Wow.
Are you? Oh my.
Yeah. Actually, well, I had to, because I couldn't upload 10,000, I had to combine it all into a giant.
Isn't that the limit too? Isn't 10,000 the limit?
I don't know. I mean, it wasn't even 10,000, but I couldn't get the data up there. So then I had to use AI to give me a command to squish them all together into one giant file and then upload it. And then that worked fine. That was actually okay. But at first,
because it has a maximum of 10,000 files, but one file can be upwards of 200 megabytes.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was just text. So it was easy to fit. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So like if you have that one big text file and you ask it a question, Nirmal, to your point about categorization, it's just going to do a semantic, and it's going to find chunks just within that, like, oh, here's a little bit, here's a little bit, here's a little bit. And then it pulls those chunks back. And then here's where the hallucinations come in. If Bret said something like 3 years ago that made sense for Docker, but it didn't, so put 3 years down at the bottom and put this recent question up at the top, then it might sort of mix that knowledge together, because it pulled back what I call like the salt and pepper knowledge and came up with its best answer. So that's where you have parametric data, you have learning that you put in the context window. Retrieval is pulling information back. Same thing, puts it in the context window, but it doesn't have the whole document, right? So like when you're talking to it, and that's where we're kind of getting back into the thing again of like, hey, we can fine tune this thing. So this is more like the third. Can we do our own parametric data? And that's where personal AI, the company, kind of gets into. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of the next wave and revolution with these small language models, where we're able to take a 1 billion or 3 billion model that's open source, like maybe Llama 3.2 or these other ones, depending upon the task we have it, and start giving it that knowledge, that sort of fuzzier, lighter blue rather than the hard blue of the knowledge that we give it in the context window, and mix those together in clever ways to come back with better answers.
Got it. So where do you see this in the future? So that's like that future state where all of us would have our own personal fine-tuned models based off of, either, closed big models or open source models or multiple models, probably based on the task, and that we fine tune with our own repositories of data. And we just like when we're using these tools, we're accessing our own personal fine-tuned models that have our voice, that have our data. So is that the kind of where we're going to be 6 months from now, or like the main way we're going to start doing these things in the future?
Yeah, I'll have my bot talk to your bot.
I mean, honestly, there's endless jokes about how, like, someone said, I was listening to something where they said recently they were in the virtual Google AI characters for Meet, like the AI assistants that can be in Meet, I guess, and take notes for you. And there were meetings that where it was nothing but they saw a meeting where it was nothing but AI assistants.
Yeah, like, everybody sent in their surrogates or something.
Yeah, and it reminded me of there's a scene in Real Genius. Actually, this was on the Verge podcast, great podcast. And they were talking about one of my favorite movies, Real Genius from the 80s, where people started taking it's in a university, and it's like all these super smart scientists are making lasers, students, and they go to class and they take their tape recorders, and then pretty soon the students are not in class, they're just putting their tape recorders down to record. And then the next scene you see is the professor he has a tape recorder playing the session, and then everyone else is just recording it. So it's a room full of tape recorders. One's playing and everybody else is recording. And that's basically what now Meet and Zoom and I think everything's going to be. Is like, we're not going to be in meetings anymore. We're just going to have a bunch of meetings. We're going to get a bunch of AI. I mean, I personally, for all of our business meetings, I use the Zoom AI assistant to record it. And then I can ask it questions. It sends summaries in email to people. Sometimes people are late and we can just keep going without them, and then they can catch up later. I mean, that's actually happened in the last month. I mean, I feel like we're so beyond the chatbot, but it's also a complete shit show and nothing knows what it's doing and they're all wrong and you can't trust anything. So it's weird that we're at this dichotomy of so much, it's everywhere, but also it's garbage at the same time.
Yeah. So that's the next question I had, Ken, is that, you're starting to use these tools. Do you turn the temperature of the responses all the way to zero? Like, how do you deal with the hallucination? Hallucination is kind of a misnomer, because in theory, everything that this bot is creating is a hallucination. But how do you validate the output, and how do you make sure that it's more trustworthy over time, potentially? Or what are some patterns there or best practices?
I feel like I now want a bumper sticker that says temperature 00 all the time, right? Like,
so can you just explain what I said that word, and probably for the audience, they might not know what that means, but can you just explain what I meant by temperature? And yes, we should definitely make that bumper sticker.
Yeah, I'll try. I think there's two parameters that are key across models. One is temperature. The other is pop something. I can't remember, but they always say don't adjust two, just adjust one. And I think the one that everybody cares about is temperature. And I just call it randomness, right? Like, it's a creative liberty, right? It's a creative liberty slider. It adds stochastic joy to whatever comes out of the LLM, to where it's able to make, I'm guessing here, the parametric data jumps that it makes are a little bit more liberal. All right. So as it's connecting word to word, thought to thought, it's allowed to sort of go a little bit wider spread than it normally would, which is frankly what I do anyway. So I appreciate temperature 1.0, but I'm really at 00 all day long.
Yeah. So the one analogy I can give is, if anyone has watched the movie Interstellar, there's a robot in that movie called TARS. And at some point, some of the humans asked TARS to adjust the humor percentage of the responses of that robot. And I think of that as temperature. At some point, the humor was asked too high, and it started making very sarcastic comments in response to whatever the humans in that movie were trying to ask. So Ken, you're running yours at temperature 00. So what are some other best practices for kind of, how do you trust the responses that you're getting? And do you get into a full sense of trust over time the more you use it?
Yeah, I don't think these things will ever come back with the response that I like at the beginning, right? Like, you have to keep talking to it. So that's actually kind of a thing too, right? Like, talking to it. So I was lucky enough to be at OpenAI Dev Day a couple weeks ago, at the beginning of October. was an amazing event. So somehow it's just like an invite only, and through whatever means, knew a few people there, got the invite out, went. And I don't want to sound like a kooky person, but it was kind of life-changing, right? Just being at an open AI event, getting to spend time with a whole bunch of folks that are kind of thought leadering and experimenting and tinkering around trying to make this stuff. And then also hearing, like, I'm not a Sam Altman stan, but when they go out and talk about this stuff, you're like, yeah, this major change is coming. And they released during that time the real-time API. So that's basically their conversational stuff that you can do now. So they demoed that a long time ago. I think it was a Spring Dev Day, our spring release in April. And you now have through an API where you can actually talk to AI. And again, I think that's the feedback. There's this life hack that I do. I should publish a blog article just on this one little life hack. But if you can set up Mac OS in such a way to where you can double tap the command key, it basically turns any input field hooked up to the microphone here. So I talk to AI all the time anyway, because I just kind of double click my command key, and wherever I'm talking to Claude or OpenAI or whatever app, it's a global input key, so I can just talk to it. But this is groundbreaking because while you're talking to it, it also can asynchronously call tools on your behalf, and you can interrupt it. So while it's actually streaming the output of the response, it can actually be streaming the output of tool calls. So it has a split mind capability. So one of the things that I've been finding to deal with the hallucinations, Nirmal, as you asked, is just keep talking to it. And I find if I were to type that out, I can't really coerce it into what I was thinking, into where I was going, to how it might need to write a particular thing or the code that it might need to do. So I just talk to it like a real person, and I get a lot better results. And I pour out that stream of consciousness. But I think that's going to be a critical tool for the personal AI, is to be able to talk to it, have it make those decisions on what to pull out, which type of context window strategy to use, whether it's built on your fine-tuned model, doing sort of salt and pepper retrieval, or sort of deep learning where it kind of understands that the problem that you asked it is so deep that it has to take 100 documents and put them in a long context window and think about it.
Yeah. So you brought up a really interesting thing, which is, I think they're called agents within the ML world and the LM world, which is these tools, these bots being able to run other software on your behalf. And some examples I've used in the past is I was trying to convert some documents from one format to another. And in ChatGPT, it would create the Python script and then run that Python script. And essentially, that's an environment, and that the ChatGPT is able to run agents on your behalf, right? Like in that example, a Python script that would then actually take the input I gave it, the input document, and then output the document format that I wanted. That's a very powerful thing. And I saw that Anthropic released the ability for Claude to control a computer, right? So to see the desktop, to move the mouse, essentially creating the ultimate API for anything that doesn't have an API already. Because if it's like a piece of software that doesn't have an API, but you need to interact with it through a user interface of some sort, then this is like the way to interact with that software as the last resort. And I think that will provide an ability to open up agents to basically anything that can be run on a computer, whether it has an API or not, a direct API or not. And so, Ken, do you use that kind of agent ability on top of like just the knowledge retrieval as well?
No, I haven't. I did there's an article on my blog I did a long time ago about how to use Ideogram to generate consistent creative for my blog. And in that case, the Ideogram did not have an API, right? In a normal tool calling method, I would have asked the agent to make a decision. It would have called the tool. It would have given me the parameters that I needed with that tool to call it. And then I would have used my computer or whatever server that was running on to go make an API call and do that. And it didn't, right? So if I would have had this particular Anthropic, what do they call it? Computer control, I think, or computer use beta.
Yeah, it just came out. Correct. Yeah.
And it harkens back to the O1 Lite, right? I believe that was the product where they were or the Rabbit. I think it was the Rabbit. That's what it was called, where they were saying, hey, this thing, and then we kind of cracked it up, open the hood. It was like, okay, this is really just Puppet underneath, right? And honestly, when you look at if you go look at the code for the Claude Anthropic, it's basically the same thing. It's a Docker image. It's various tools installed in that Docker image that the scripts know how to work with. So they know how to move the mouse pointer around and stuff like that. And they call it the agent loop, which I think is interesting because not only is the tool call happening, but it's it's in its own task loop, right? Like I need to do this thing. And I know in this one task, I need to move the pointer here. I need to click on the browser tab, and it's in that persistent loop. So I haven't hooked that up in personal AI yet. I have done the one where I've had it open my browser window and, with that assistant with the ideogram, because it didn't have an API. So it would basically just rely on installing command line tools on the Mac. Like it knew it had to know that OSA script was there. So again, for the computer use one with Anthropic, it's a Docker image, it's GNU screenshot that they're using. So it's not as, what's the word, where it's sort of able to go across anybody's computer and do stuff yet, right? Like there's still a lot of building there.
It's OS specific, but there's no technical challenge there to, like, what it's doing now with those tools doesn't mean that it can support other operating systems in the future, for sure. So that's not a real technical challenge right now. It's mostly about the pattern. Bret, are you using any kind of agent tools? I know you built that bot based on your knowledge repository, but are you having these bots execute programs and do things for you?
Not yet. I do have OpenAI's Mac app, so it makes it really just easier to talk or ask questions in a little pop-up window instead of bringing up a browser tab. That's not the same thing, but I'm kind of just waiting for them to go, oh, this thing now can control your computer. And it just like one day has an update and suddenly it's opening up iTerm for me or whatever. Cursor, the dev tool, we haven't really talked about it, but it kind of, what you were talking about, it's doing stuff in the background. It actually has a beta feature that you have to manually enable, but what it'll end up doing is it creates a shadow session of your IDE and the code, and it runs it and is basically learning and running it in the background and doing things in the background away from what you're doing in order to make sure the code's functioning, or I guess to learn it. You have to enable it, and I didn't notice that it made the AI better during my development, but that's why it's a beta feature. So it's technically doing stuff, but it's really just trying to learn more about my coding and what I'm doing in the moment. I wouldn't say it's like an agent. Quite honestly, if there was anyone I was going to predict that would have something like this, where it could do things outside of my computer on my behalf, I think it'd be something like Zapier, or something that was already, if this then that, or something like that. Some company that already had a connection to hundreds of other APIs, and then they could just bot that and then give you access to the bot, so that if you've ever used anything like Zapier, shout out to them because they're from Missouri, my home state. Not a lot of tech companies in mid-Missouri, but they are one of those. And I haven't seen anything from them. They actually may have it. I didn't actually look before the show, but there's a great discussion that was, I think it was on the Verge podcast, maybe the Pivot podcast. And they were talking in just the last couple of weeks about this challenge of the idea of us having like a personal assistant that's going in, like everyone's showing the examples of like, get me a flight or book me a car or get me that dinner reservation or all that. And what everyone's like glossing over is that we have two models right now on the internet for how to do that. You either go heavyweight and it's running a browser, a headless browser that's pulling up web pages on your behalf and logging in as you on those websites and scraping each page, figuring it out and like clicking buttons in virtual windows, which is to me that's not scalable. That we would boil the ocean essentially trying to do that. Or we rely on APIs, but those APIs mean that every airline and every car rental and every restaurant and every place you want to go, they all have to have an AI that's accessible by a bunch of these other AI companies. And there is zero incentive for anyone to do that. It was actually a great thought experiment real quick on there. Uber Eats, like the whole job of Uber Eats is to get you in the app and to get you to buy more and to there's a lot going on there. But if I never have to open the app and I can just ask my Google Assistant or whatever to go, get me some takeout delivered, Uber Eats is nothing but, it reduces the value of them. So they're probably never going to go in on it, right? It's not beneficial to their revenue streams. So it was an interesting argument of they're all claiming this is coming and there's no viable way that it's actually going to work. Because we haven't figured out a model that is both incentivized for companies to allow this to happen and that it's not so heavyweight that we're all paying for virtual Chromium browsers on servers somewhere scanning the internet or doing things on the internet on our behalf. It's going to have all our passwords, log in all our websites for us and do things. It just, I don't think
it's where I think the integrated ecosystems have the leg up here, right? So within Microsoft Copilot plus PC or Apple with Apple Intelligence on whatever the M3 chips are. So the idea is that with the framework they came out with, that we haven't really seen a lot of it yet, right? We're just kind of getting a hint of what Apple Intelligence can do, but it all sits on top of this app intense framework. And when you're in that integrated ecosystem, you kind of are incentivized, right? So if my notes app and your favorite and another app want to talk together, it sort of incentivizes me to sort of publish that app intense so that, because Siri's going to be there on the phone no matter what, right? And if Siri's there on the phone and it's a valuable part of the human interacting with my personal AI, because that's really going to be where personal AI catches first, right? It's just going to be that thing in your hand. Then developers will start building to app intents. But then you have this other thing called the internet, right? We've incentivized building websites. So at some point in time, I think with the integrated ecosystems and the experiences that people have there with their personal AI through app intents or through the open API specification that Microsoft Copilot is built around that allows that same thing to happen, it's basically going to force companies to start to build those semantic interfaces and those agentic interfaces because their personal devices will start doing it for them.
Quick survey, are we excited about Apple Intelligence? Are we waiting with bated breath?
I'm excited because essentially what we're talking about for the last hour goes from something that is very bleeding edge, right? And like just these patterns that we barely even have a name, right, for the kinds of things that we're talking about here, right? Like I'm pulling out like some of the language, like temperature and agents and knowledge graphs and RAG. We barely have even like some kind of taxonomy or way of talking about these things. Whereas once Apple Intelligence is on a gajillion devices and people start interacting with it in those guardrailed way, of course, in those sandboxed kind of ways, but there'll be a language around describing what your Apple device is doing with respect to, it's generating a text message response for me. It's generating an image based on what I'm asking for, or it's editing my photograph, or it's running, it's going out and reserving an Uber Eats delivery for me. There'll be like whatever Apple decides to name those actions and those activities and those patterns will make it easier for us to communicate how we're like the general patterns, and we'll have a language that everyone is kind of more used to using, which I know it sounds like very basic, but that's a very important thing because we're talking about a very complex thing. And even in the context of when I was asking about the agents doing something on our behalf, there's a lot of layers here and a lot of permutations of that, right? Are you using an LLM to create a prompt for another LLM? Are you having it create the command line program that then you have to go and run yourself? Or are you giving it access to your compute and letting it run itself? There's a lot of like different angles and ways of using these tools. And it's starting to become very hard to even communicate what we're talking about and making sure that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about, which I think Apple Intelligence will allow us to basically describe like, this, if I'm using KHGPT to troubleshoot an EKS cluster and I give it access to kubectl to run kubectl commands, that's the same thing as if I'm on my Apple device and I ask Siri to order a Uber for me. It's, that's a quick analogy that will allow us to communicate these more complex things in an easier way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what you're describing exactly is, I think I said this before on the show, Richard Campbell of the .NET podcast, I think last year, he was doing a conference talk, and the quote was something around, look, AI is not new. We've been using the word for decades. It's just a zeitgeist, popular pop culture thing right now. And that AI is the name we give things that don't have their own feature name or product name yet. And that's exactly what you're saying is like, we're labeling all this stuff with AI because it's cool, but that's not a way to talk about what these things do. And we don't, like generative images, like maybe that's a better word for, a dozen tools out there that I use, Adobe Firefly, like all the Stable Diffusion, all that stuff. So we're starting to have these terms, and so they're just going to all end up being features. Like the Notion AI, I feel like in a decade is just going to be, if it's not built in for free, I'm still having to pay for it separately. It won't probably, I don't know if it probably won't be called AI. It'll probably be just called Notion Assistant or Notion Answers or Notion it'll just be a text response that I ask it questions about my data and it gives me information back. I do want to throw out, because I know we're running out of time, I want to throw out a couple of things while we were thinking. One of my favorite, I was going to ask, on mobile, because we don't yet have it on, at least on the Apple side of things, as a built-in OS, we're literally days away. I think it's next week when .1 comes out and we get some of the first wave. What your preferred thing is to use on mobile. I was using ChatGPT's app for a while and talking to it, but I'm a big Arc fan, and so I was just going to throw out that I use Arc. I've been using Arc Search since it was in beta, and they have a mode now where it's my default browser on my phone, and if you just take your phone when you're in the browser and you bring it to your ear, it makes essentially like a phone call to the AI. It's the image on the right, so you're on what looks like a phone call, and you just have a conversation with the AI. And so you ask it questions. I mean, this is just it's using OpenAI on the back end, I think, and so it's just making free calls to. I don't know if it's 3.5 or I don't know what exactly their model is. I know they're not like an AI company, so they're just probably using an API of someone else. But it's kind of fun to just bring it to my ear, and then I can put it on speaker, or I can listen to it like I'm talking to somebody. But I'm literally making a phone call, or it feels like a phone call to an AI. That's what I just been using it that way because it's fun, and it doesn't require me to open up a separate app. It's just the browser, cool. The app that I'm usually already in all the time. So,
yeah.
What about you?
Go for it, Ken.
I hadn't used this. I didn't know Arc could do that. I haven't used anything on. Is the question, Brett, on the phone specifically?
Yeah, just like do you have an AI on the phone, like a general AI that the ChatGPT? I'm assuming. I mean, I know I have a Perplexity app, I have an Anthropic app, I have a ChatGPT app, I have like Arc. I have a dozen apps that all have an LLM behind them, and I was just curious if you did that on mobile, and which one you like the most. If you did that.
The only thing that would cross over, I'm not a big mobile user. I'm still the hacker of the 90s carrying my laptop around, I guess, in most cases. But the one that really does bridge between desktop and mobile is Perplexity. And so, like Nirmal, I think that kind of checks the box too of agents, right? Because what's actually happening under the hood is I'm asking it a question, or I'm asking it to do some research for me, and it's creating a plan, and then it's multi-threaded executing that plan. It's got multiple agents going out and doing individual parts of that plan, and then bringing back all the answers for me. And I'll use that. The only time I really use my phone for internet searches and stuff is just like real quick information. And so Apple Intelligence, at least I don't think it's out yet, everybody for me, or at least I haven't turned it on yet.
Not out. It's an OS update that comes next week that we'll get the first wave.
Sorry. So that's when I'll start using it.
Yeah, next week.
I think I'm waiting. So I've used ChatGPT and Anthropic on my phone, but I think where the power is for all this is the agents, like doing things on my behalf. Like the knowledge and the content generation is great, but I think once it's integrated into this like ability to do actions on my behalf, then that's going to open up more of what I want to do with those kind of things on my mobile phone. So, and I think that will be it'll be a very common pattern if it releases successfully next week. I think, a year from now when we have, if we have another conversation like this, we'll be very used to it, and the real test is going to be, I'll get my mom's phone updated and see how she interacts with it and see how that looks like for someone that's not very tech savvy. So very interested to see her experiment with it.
Yeah, there was the Wall Street Journal had a interview with Craig at Apple, essentially, and it's a pretty good interview. They're talking about Apple Intelligence, like why is it delayed, like why are they bringing it? Basically, all the answers are it's hard, and they're trying to do it right, and they're never first, and she even brings that up, and that's because I feel like this model is right. We're going to have a personal AI on devices that has way more access to our information that can be much more useful for helping us do real life stuff based on what it knows about us, our schedules, our emails, maybe our documents, our photos, our location. Mm-hmm. And then there's the generic, sort of like the untrusted AIs. And that's what they're doing is I'm assuming I'll have to put in my OpenAI key to get full features with it. And I'll ask it questions. I'll be talking to Siri all day long. And then when it needs general information, like a Wikipedia page or whatever, it's handing off to OpenAI for that generic stuff with a very large model. That
for the time being, yeah. They call that real world knowledge. When it needs real world knowledge, it'll eject out to that.
until we have 100 gig memory in our phones.
The thing that's interesting too with Apple underneath the hood is their small language model pattern of LoRA with adapters over top. So it's basically the same core model. And I don't know where this comes in with personal AI and how we're going to use our own fine-tuned /LoRA adapter pattern stuff, right? But like they're able to get the Genmoji to do what it's the same model, but they just put a different LoRA adapter over top of it to get the model to do either summarization or Genmoji creation and stuff like that. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Do you know what a LoRA is? I'm not familiar. So do you know how to describe that?
I think that's low rank adapter or something like that.
Yeah, low rank adaptation of large language models.
Right. So I don't really know, so I'm probably going to get it wrong. But the way I describe it as you have this parametric data, you have a brain, and it's got like bumps and everything like that proves where knowledge is stored. And then LoRA is kind of like a mesh that sits over top of it that emphasizes certain neurons versus others.
Got it. So it's a way to kind of direct the area of interest of a response. Yes. Yeah, interesting. So much to cover.
Yeah, we've only got a few minutes left, but I did want to answer the question we had earlier because I was looking it up while you all were talking. Zapier has AI, but it's really just for making more zaps. So like which this makes total sense because the interface for making an automation zap is very advanced and awesome, but it takes a while. I mean, my typical zap is like 30 minutes to an hour to finish. I do a lot of Slack ones, and so I need to format Markdown and do all this stuff. But they're giving examples of like, hey, Zapier, can you describe the thing? The thing can be done. If I get an email from vendor X, save the attachment to G Drive and Slack message to the team. I literally created a zap for that kind of scenario in the last year. It would be much easier if I could just tweet it or whatever this is. If I could so that's how they're, in other words, we're not going to be able to schedule a plane ticket through this yet. But also, that's literally the last thing I think I'll ever want my AI to do is schedule my travel because I'm old in particular. It's just going to give me a flight on, some cheap airline in the back of the cabin.
You'll be forced to clap when the plane lands.
It won't let me check bags because it didn't understand that ticket. Like there's just that to me is there's a lot of intelligence that's required in understanding how to buy an airplane ticket. It's not just a simple give me an any ticket on any airline on any location. That's oversimplification right there. But anyway, all right. Last takes. Any hot takes? Any last thoughts?
We talked about a lot of things. So back to the Zapier thing. I think another area to keep an eye on is the ITSM space, right? So the IT service management space, which is, all the things that you would open a ticket for, the ServiceNow kind of stuff, I think is where there is going to be a lot of value with this sharp edge, smoothing the sharp edges of automation, integrating systems together that don't have like a very easy API to integrate with, a lot of data transformation. Again, this goes back to what Bret and I talked about on the DevOps Paradox podcast that was released a couple of weeks ago, where we talked about how the integration of AI into software and our services is going to be mostly as a feature, either hidden or not, like either, shown up front to you or not, but it's less likely going to be the actual product and more likely going to be a feature of all the things that we use on a day-to-day basis. Over to you, Ken. Any final thoughts?
I very much agree that AI is a feature, not a product, right? And that's where we got a lot of the things wrong. Yeah, I can't stress this enough, right? Be thinking about personal AI right now. Be thinking about ways that you can automate yourself and your decisioning. And that's a good thing, right? That's going to hopefully elevate you to do stuff that you just probably weren't to do. Think of yourself as the authority. Think of yourself as the person that has the knowledge, that has maybe the assistants around you, and you're just kind of coordinating them sort of rapid fire. And if you don't have an exocortex now, start getting one, start taking notes, start building that knowledge up, because eventually you're going to want to kind of hand that off to some assistant and do stuff. And it's Apple. They are going to be slow and they are going to get it right. And that's the hot take. They will define, the integrated ecosystems will define personal AI. And then if your business hasn't started thinking on ways that an AI agent can come knocking at your door, start thinking about it now.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Very true. Go for it, Bret.
what was it? It's not the AI taking your job. It's going to be the person who knows how to use AI that's going to take your job.
Well said.
Yeah, I firmly, I still think that's the hot take of, like, if we're worried about, by the way, like, being in the middle of all this, I'm not worried that AI is taking our jobs yet. We're so I have a friend who's like so bullish. He was telling me like 3 months after ChatGPT released that like devs are going to get fired in mass, and like I don't have a job, and
they will, but then they'll just figure out we shouldn't have fired them.
Yeah. It'll hire all 20,000 people back. Yeah. I mean, in my entire career for 30 years, this question of, oh, this new technology is going to let us fire all the devs. And then no, it just makes us more efficient and lets us do more, because if everyone has it, then everyone has to use it, because we're all like, the rising tide lifts all boats or whatever. It's not a competitive advantage when it's a public application that everyone can use. So that just means that just like DevOps have to use automation tools. We didn't have Terraform 30 years ago. So it was okay as a sysadmin. I could only run like 10 servers because I was too busy managing 10 servers. Now, if I can't run 1,000 servers, I'm a crappy DevOps. So that's just tooling. And so I feel like all of this is just tooling, making us, allowing us to do more with our jobs, in our jobs. And I mean, yes, obviously there will be churn in certain job markets where it's, you're doing one little thing, but I'm not seeing mass layoffs, and maybe I'm just not seeing it happen in real time, but I'm not.
There's a name for it, Brett. It's called Jevons paradox, right? We made coal more efficient and we burn more coal, right? So that's what's going to happen.
Okay. I'm going to have to look that up. The last little thing, it's not really a hot take, but we've had shows all year long about AI stuff. We're not an AI podcast, but it is all we talk about recently in our casual conversations at conferences. Like everyone wants to know how to run an LLM and Kubernetes. Everyone wants to know all the tools they run. So we've had shows. We had LLM. We had an ML Ops show, if you want to look back in this YouTube channel for that. We had Continue.dev on the show, which is an open source tool for allowing you to choose your LLM in your code editor. So I kind of feel like we have dev tooling for coding, and then we have all this personal assistant stuff. And I feel like they're two separate camps, in no way connected right now. So Cursor.ai, if you haven't looked at it, which is a competitor to GitHub Copilot, Continue.dev, which is a open source competitor to other tools like that.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, for being on and helping me understand this space, and both of you, Bret and Ken, helping me understand this space. And my main takeaway is that we shouldn't don't sleep on these tools. People are using them. People are getting value out of them. So if you're on the fence, start experimenting today.
Yeah, you got to spend some time with it. You got to put the effort in. Honestly, it's necessary. It's like learning a new programming language, basically. So yeah. Well, thanks everyone for being here. We're live on Thursdays, and Ken, thanks again so much for being here a second time. You're a repeat guest, and now you're an alumni. So we should send you a T-shirt or a hat or something as a thank you.
Next time we'll have all of our agents and surrogates do it for us.
Yes,
that's right.
There we go.
Right.
All right.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks everybody. Thank you.
Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.